Hey folks, welcome back to Indaba Africa. This is Chris once again. And several years ago during a master's program, I researched a paper. I didn't have an opinion on this. This is about the Keystone XL Pipeline. And I didn't have an opinion on it. So I researched this paper and produced it, and in the end came up with a recommendation. It was supposed to be a recommendation, a policy position paper. So that's what I did. At the time, I was ambivalent, agnostic about whether the Keystone XL pipeline was a good idea or bad idea, and I heard arguments on both sides. So I researched it and came to a conclusion, and you'll hear my recommendation. So what follows is in response to President Joe Biden, Unity Joe's unconstitutional, illegitimate use of executive orders to stop the construction and use of the Keystone XL pipeline. This was my paper, and I'm going to read it to you. So if you don't want to hear me reading a paper, you might want to drop out. But if you do find this interesting, this is from a decade ago, almost a decade ago, 9 years ago. And this is about the Keystone XL pipeline. So much of it still applies today and is legitimate for today's conversation. So here's it goes. In the midst of an energy boom arising because of rapidly increasing tight oil production and natural gas fracking, the United States faces a question over whether to build the Keystone XL pipeline, continue to rely on other means of transport, or altogether different source of energy to meet America's energy needs. The Keystone XL project would deliver crude oil from Canadian oil sands and the Bakken Formation to refineries in the Gulf states. Now, the Bakken Formation is in North Dakota. That's what we're talking about. And what we're talking about here at the pipeline is that we had other source of oil, so the oil sands had lost prominence at this stage. So is it worthwhile to have the oil sands pipeline? So there you go. That frames it. The Keystone XL project evokes strong political debate from both left and right of the political spectrum. TransCanada originally applied for a presidential permit for the Keystone XL pipeline in 2008. However, the U.S. has yet to approve the project. This was a decade ago. Of course, Trump lifted that and the project was approved. This paper will argue in favor of the Keystone XL project as, on balance, it is beneficial and diversifies U.S. energy supply. This brief paper attempts to uncover the truth and address the current situation, the impact of approving and building the pipeline, rail transport as an alternative, and finally, a proposed path to the future. Every U.S. administration since the 1973 oil crisis has advocated for energy independence. As President Obama's energy policy pledge to cut a third of oil imports by 2020 clearly demonstrates, such streams of oil autarky continue to dominate U.S. energy policy. The Keystone XL pipeline would include 875 miles of 36-inch pipe with the capacity to transport 830,000 barrels per day to refineries, primarily in the Gulf states. This pipeline could also have spurs to carry tight oil from the Bakken Formation, where production has grown tenfold in less than a decade to nearly 1 million barrels a day. Because it would cross the Canadian-U.S. border, construction of the Keystone XL requires a presidential permit from the State Department. Now, one argument in favor of the Keystone XL pipeline is that it would reduce energy dependence on Middle East oil. Unfortunately, that's a canard. Now, people in favor of this said that's why we don't need Middle East oil dependency. But as I said, it was a canard. It's dishonest. Oil is a globally traded fungible commodity. Self-sufficiency in oil would not shield U.S. consumers from oil price shocks as increases occur globally. However, the pipeline offers many genuine advantages. It would strengthen relations with Canada and provide a conduit for oil from a friendly neighbor, which is already our largest source of oil imports with 2.9 million barrels per day at that time, thereby decreasing dependence on distant suppliers in politically fragile regions. A rare point in this debate is the ecologically friendly reality that refining petroleum closer to consumer markets ultimately reduces energy transport cost and pollution. Every energy dollar that remains in North America improves the tightly integrated U.S. and Canadian economies to mutual benefit. The Keystone XL project will reduce the cost of energy for shippers and producers while increasing energy market flexibility. It will also feed the most advanced and efficient refineries with lower carbon production. This will keep U.S. refineries running and ensures thousands of refining industry jobs. The Gulf Coast region holds half of U.S. refining capacity. Gulf Coast refiners want the Keystone XL pipeline because it will deliver a steady supply of heavy sour crude, lowering input costs relative to current available options. Keystone XL would also alleviate two potential bottlenecks in the pipeline transportation system between Western Canada and the United States and the U.S. Midwest and the Gulf Coast. Risks associated with the Keystone XL pipeline project include increased carbon dioxide production, pipeline spills, and the continued dependence on petroleum. Early opposition to Keystone XL centered on ecological risks, including disruption of environmentally sensitive areas and wildlife habitat loss. This included concerns over environmental impacts in the Sand Hills region of Nebraska. However, in January 2013, Nebraska's governor approved a new route through the state that avoids the Sand Hills, thereby eliminating much of the basis for concern. Landowners and communities along the route are worried oil spills may contaminate their land or water. Their concerns are not baseless. From 2002 to 2012, an estimated 474,000 barrels of crude oil spilled in pipeline incidents in the U.S. over 12 years, mind you. Some stakeholders also object to the Keystone XL pipeline because it would increase U.S. supplies of oil and thereby perpetuate the nation's dependence on imported fossil fuels and increase carbon emissions from the transportation sector. However, the State Department has found that construction of the Keystone XL pipeline would have little bearing on greenhouse gas emissions. Funny how nobody knows that story, but it was in the report, which I cite in my paper. There are risks with maintaining the current status quo in which the project remains in limbo. These risks include increased shipping costs for Bakken Formation tight oil and rail accidents associated with increased shipping volumes. Additionally, increased energy costs for crude by rail shipping will dampen economic growth. From an ecological standpoint, the potential of a Trans-Rockies pipeline from Alberta to British Columbia over and through sensitive land and sea lanes poses an environmental threat far in excess of the Keystone XL project. Crude by rail transport is an existing alternative to the Keystone XL pipeline. The rail industry suggests moving oil by rail, vice by pipeline, has many advantages. The industry asserts advantages of rail over pipeline, including geographic flexibility, responsiveness, and efficiency, underlying infrastructure, and product purity. These rail industry claims are questionable. While the U.S. cargo rail network is far larger and more diverse than the pipeline network, it remains more expensive and traverses heavily populated areas. Crude by rail is less attractive than the rail industry claims. For example, its criticism of pipelines for larger spills than rail is disingenuous. It's true, according to U.S. Department of Transportation data, the spill rate of crude oil for railroads from 2002 to 2012 was estimated at 2.2 gallons per million ton miles, compared with 6.3 for pipelines. So on the surface, that would look like pipelines spill 3 times as much oil as trains do. However, spill rates are not a useful statistic, as spill volume is arguably a relatively unimportant factor in terms of impact and cleanup cost. Location matters more. Pipelines tend to be remote, while rail lines most often run through densely populated areas where the risk of an oil spill would have far greater impact. Rail is also a relatively expensive method of transporting oil. Moving Bakken Formation crude by rail only briefly became cost-effective owing to artificial price discounts which resulted from pipeline bottlenecks. Railroad transportation costs $10 to $15 per barrel compared with $5 for a pipeline. So for every barrel produced in the tar sands, which already requires $75 as a break-even point, you're adding $10 to $15. So you're making it $85 to $90 a barrel before you can break even, which means you can't produce in the tar sands, which of course is what the green wacko environmentalists want, as opposed to $5 per barrel for a pipeline. The lack of tank cars and loading and unloading infrastructure has also hindered the expansion of crude by rail. Rail cars have an economic life of 30 to 40 years, so conversion of the fleet to a new car standard could take longer than a decade, hampering future growth in tight oil production. Of course, that wasn't done, so that is still a true statement today. A decade later, it would still take another decade to produce enough oil cars in order to carry this oil. The true impact of Keystone XL on both the environment and the economy would be more limited than either its supporters or its opponents suggest. Given the complexities of the energy sector and the high demand for affordable energy to fuel our economy, the Keystone XL pipeline is a reasonable and useful means to diversify sources and meet our energy needs, as well as a way to maintain operational refining capacity in the Gulf states. The financial benefits are advantageous to North American business and consumers. An Energy Policy Research Foundation study concluded the Keystone XL expansion would provide net economic benefits from improved efficiencies in both the transportation and processing of crude oil of $100 to $600 million annually. The United States federal government should grant approval for construction of the Keystone XL pipeline immediately. While advocates arguments in favor of this suggest it is vital to our national energy independence and will create jobs, they overstate their case. Nonetheless, broad-based sources of energy from diverse locations are essential for America's economic and national security. While the Keystone XL pipeline will not be the solution to a stable energy market in the United States, it is still an important part of a diversified energy market essential to the United States' national security. And so you can see from a holistic standpoint, when I look at national security, it's not simply troops, tanks, bombers, aircraft carriers. It's far more diverse. Infectious disease, power grids, cyber vulnerabilities, immigration, border sovereignty, and energy. And this is an important consideration. I wrote that paper 8 years ago, not 10 years ago. So 8 years ago, 2013 is when I did, so 8 years ago. And you can see that most of what I said is still applicable today, although this was eventually approved under Trump and the pipeline got underway. Joe Biden's effort to stamp out the Keystone XL Pipeline is wiping out anywhere from 10,000 to 80 to 100,000 jobs, according to different industry analysts. And that's unfortunate. This oil will be shipped over sensitive environmental lands in the Rocky Mountains to the west coast of Canada, loaded on oil tankers and shipped to China because they're insatiable. And they'll convert it to useful burning fuels and very polluting refineries. And the chances of a tanker spill or accident or sinking in the straits along Victoria and Vancouver as well as Seattle are astronomical. Not to mention the potential pouring of oil over the sensitive Rocky Mountains when all they have to do is build a benign pipeline that reduces the cost by 50 to 150% of transport and fill refineries in the Gulf states that are sitting idle in capacity use for this heavy sour crude. Anyway, folks, there you have it. That's a paper that I wrote, as I said, for a graduate program about 8 years ago, postgraduate. And there you go. Anyway, so folks, comments, thoughts, appreciate it. Biden's actions are counterproductive to U.S. national security and will have repercussions in the energy market, not just for the United States, but globally. And this is especially harmful in a time when the global economy is in flux as a consequence of feckless malgovernance and malfeasance by political actors around the planet using a pandemic with a fatality rate of 0.2% to shut down the world's economy and drive up energy costs. You see, these political leaders would rather see you starve to death, freeze to death in your huts and your shacks and your trailers than to be warm and to be healthy. If you're not a subscriber to Chris White Africa, hey, why not become one? Smash that subscription button. Boom. Be sure to toggle the bell icon to get notified of updates. And finally, smash the like button. We appreciate likes. It helps drive viewership. And I hope you appreciate this video on the Keystone XL Pipeline. More coming to you. Take care, folks.